I've always found Assassin's Creed to be a deeply philosophical franchise. I think much more philosophical than people give it credit for. The reason why is because I believe that at the core of the main overarching plot in most of these games holds a lot of really interesting philosophy that goes deeper than your traditional philosophical stances that you see in sci-fi games. For example, Star Wars is often quoted as having very interesting philosophy, but I don't think it goes any deeper than, starting off by saying that there's a good and bad and then coming to the realization that most of morality is a gray area in the middle. There's a lot of moments in Assassin's Creed that have really made me think and have discussions with my friends about the philosophy behind the statements and the beliefs that we see these characters portray. And it would be impossible to only in one video analyze all of them or go into an in-depth exploration of them, but I did want to just share some of my favorite quotes that I've seen in the entire franchise and the ones that have made me think the most, or that I consider to be the most thought-provoking. Some of them might mean more to you than others, but I'm just going to go through each one, read them out to you, and then tell you my interpretation as someone who has no place explaining philosophy because I am not a philosopher. So the first one that I want to talk about is one that even as a kid, when I played Assassin's Creed Revelations, I remember really being enamored by the way this was explained after so many games of it not really being analyzed in depth. And that's the explanation that Ezio gives Sophia when she questions the assassin motto of nothing is true, everything is permitted. That in itself has a lot of interesting philosophy in it, and the way that Ezio breaks it down is the following. To say that nothing is true is to realize that the foundations of society are fragile, and that we must be the shepherds of our own civilization. To say that everything is permitted is to understand that we are the architects of our own actions, and that we must live with their consequences, whether glorious or tragic. Aside from this being beautifully written by Darby McDevitt, I think it captures the essence of the assassin motto or modus operandi way better than most people give it credit for. Because first of all, it makes you think back to the creation of that creed and that philosophy at the beginning of the game, and you realize how well conceived the idea of the Assassin's Creed within this fictional world was. To write in two simple sentences, nothing is true, everything is permitted, and have that contain so much philosophy and so much thought about the idea of free will, freedom, control, chaos, order, and everything that philosophers have debated on for centuries is extremely remarkable for a video game franchise. Now, the two things that I think of when I read this quote is how Ezio's basically making the distinction between nihilism and absurdism, and also making a comment on existentialism. The very first part of the quote falls in line a lot with Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy. He's a philosopher that revolutionized a lot of the idea revolving absolute truths, moral truths, and divine truths. And he believed, for example, that recognizing the fragility of a societal foundation empowers individuals to create new values, and that we have to first realize that there aren't any set of objective values that can guide us or that we can look to. There's no rule book that we can abide that'll make us better or worse human beings. Rather, we as a society, we as humans have to determine what those rules are and guide our own civilization in our own best interest. And that's basically the first phrase of the Assassin's Creed MO in a nutshell. Basically saying that you have to realize society, religion, and everything that is right now giving you a prescriptivist view of moral theory is not true, and that everything that you see is a facade or a hallucination. You have to realize as an assassin that you can transcend this and become the shepherd of your own civilization. The second part of this quote, the one about being able to take accountability for our actions regardless of whether they are glorious or tragic, is something that resonates a lot with another philosopher called Jean-Paul Sartre. A lot of you probably have heard of him, and he emphasized that there's a radical human freedom that we have in the absence of predetermined moral laws. The second that we realize that these moral laws don't exist, the freedom that we experience is not mild. It's extremist freedom to the point where it becomes dangerous. And he advocated for embracing that responsibility that comes with this freedom, because our choices and their consequences are what give our lives meaning. To me, I love this sort of stuff because it's a way of studying philosophy that is engaging and interesting. I often find that when I study philosophy alone, when I do, it's not as interesting as when you debate it with people. And to channel those debates into characters that can argue one side or another and synthesize philosophy into these fictional worlds and into these factions like the Templars and the Assassins, everything becomes so much more engaging, at least for me, that I find it beautiful. So that quote is something that I really like. Now, the second quote that I have is very similar to the first one, so I won't spend too much time on it, but I think it was Altair that said, "Only a mind free of impediment is capable of grasping the chaotic beauty of the world. This is our greatest asset." This basically just echoes what Ezio was saying to Sophia, but the reason I wanted to highlight it is because outside of the philosophy, it shows the biased and dogmatic beliefs of the assassins, because there's a lot of presuppositions in this quote that I think lead to a lot of hypocrisies within the Assassin's Creed. First of all, with the quote, "chaotic beauty of the world," to look at freedom and see beauty in the chaos is something that is presupposed by the assassins that leads them to make the choices that they do, because it's very easily argued, and Templars do argue, that freedom leads to horrible, awful things, and that so much violence that comes from freedom freedom, so much disaster, so much greed is something that's not worth enduring just to maintain freedom. And you can see in this quote how Altair and the other assassins see this freedom as a beauty and choose to overlook or justify the disaster and pain that it often brings. And the second part of the quote, when he says this is our greatest asset, shows the predisposition that assassins have to wanting to promote freedom over everything else and believing truly that it's an asset. This is something that I can delve into deeper when I talk about whether Templars are right or not, but I think it's a very interesting reflection on, first of all, realizing that there are no predetermined truths, realizing that you are free as an individual, and then concluding that you should be free and that it's a beautiful asset to be free. Now, this next quote is also by Altair from one of his codex pages. He says, "I long for the day when men turn away from invisible monsters and once more embrace a more rational view of the world. But these religions are so convenient and promise such terrible punishment should one reject them. I worry that fear shall keep us stuck to what is surely the greatest lie ever told." Now, this is a brutal analysis on religion, and it's one of my favorite parts about Assassin's Creed is how critical it is of religion. Obviously, he's basically saying here that men have been, through fear, forced to be controlled by religion. And I think in AC1, the Templars discuss how religion was one of the ways that they tried to control the populace before trying the Apple of Eden and other forms. I think it was Vidic that it might have been who spoke about that. I'm not gonna start debating about religion because some of you might be religious and I'm not interested in engaging in theological debate, but the secularity or the atheistic nature of some of the assassins that is then contrasted against the culty and spiritual views that so many adopt is such an interesting dynamic, because so many assassins were not religious. Some of them were, like Bayek, for example, but again, Altair, for example, or Ezio aren't as religious later in their lives, yet they still hold what could very often be considered religious beliefs, just in a different form. And it's so interesting to see the hypocrisy of that, to see how Altair as an assassin, as a grandmaster, preaches how the loss of freedom, the loss to the Templars, the loss of autonomy, and them not performing their mission will lead to horrible, horrible things. Essentially guiding through what can be described as fear his assassins. He is almost like a religious leader, and the Assassin's Creed can almost be considered like a religion to a lot of assassins. Yet here he is, I think, very validly criticizing religion and how it's led men to think irrationally. And it's a very curious thought as to whether the beliefs of the Assassin's Creed are always rational or sometimes dogmatic and irrational. Okay, so this preachy, I'm 14 and this is deep Reddit video is almost done. I'm sorry for how obnoxious this probably is, but I do genuinely find it interesting, and I hope that you agree. I want to highlight one quote that isn't as philosophical, but it's just kind of sad and tragic and interesting to think about the idea of ambition and greed. Or maybe not greed, just ambition. And that is when Blackbeard is being killed in Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, spoiler alert, and he goes to Edward and he looks at him and he says, "In a world without gold, we might have been heroes." This is a quote that to me means so much for both Edward and Blackbeard, but just the idea of ambition and the materialistic world that men live in and so often are enslaved by. To me, this quote means that Edward and Blackbeard were such formidable, driven, intelligent, and ambitious people who, just by chance of being born into a materialistic world, were driven to chase those materialistic things and invest all their energy into something that ended up being useless because they both ended up dying. And I think of how Blackbeard is reflecting on it before he dies, essentially saying, if we had been born in a world where materialism and wealth and power were not things that were so attractive to us, we could have been heroes. We could have used this ambition and this power and this competence to do good in this world, to be good human beings. And I think that's such a beautiful and humble reflection on potential, the idea of potential, the idea that a human being can essentially decide whether they will invest their energy into something productive or destructive, and how your conditions, your philosophy, your psychology, and your upbringing kind of determine whether in a world of gold you are villains or heroes. The reality of it for me is basically saying I have been born in a world of gold, and I have to essentially decide whether I want to live a materialistic life and essentially be a villain, or let go of the idea of material possessions, become a much more minimalist human being, and drive my ambition into helping or just enjoying life as a whole. It's a very short but very interesting quote that to me leads to a lot of interpretation. And finally, I'm going to end with a long one, but I think it's worth it and I think a lot of you like it. And that is Arnos' ending speech at the end of Assassin's Creed Unity. I always say that Assassin's Creed Unity's story starts off perfectly and ends perfectly, and it's just shit in the middle. And as proof of this idea that I have, the ending speech is one of the best speeches in Assassin's Creed in my opinion, and it's basically Arnos' realization of the Creed motto, nothing is true and everything is permitted. It's kind of rephrasing what Ezio and Altair discovered in their own lives, but in a very interesting way because it's set in the backdrop of revolutionary France and it's much closer to our future, to our time, so I think it applies much more to us. So let me read it for you now. Maybe it's incomplete because this is from a Reddit post, but I think this is pretty much the whole speech. The creed of the Assassin's Brotherhood teaches us that nothing is forbidden to us. Once, I thought that meant we were free to do as we would, to pursue our ideals no matter the cost. I understand now, not a grant of permission, the creed is a warning. Ideals too easily give way to dogma. dogma becomes fanaticism. No higher power sits in judgment of us. No supreme being watches us and punishes us for our sins. In the end, only we ourselves can guard against our obsessions. Only we can decide whether the road we walk carries too high a toll. We believe ourselves redeemers, avengers, saviors. We make war on those who oppose us, and they in turn make war on us. We dream of leaving our stamp upon the world, even as we give our lives in a conflict that will be recorded in no history book. All that we do, all that we are, begins and ends with ourselves. I think apart from this speech being a beautiful reflection on Arnos' trajectory and character arc through Assassin's Creed Unity, it also has a lot of interesting commentary on our own lives that we can apply. Mainly because even though we're not part of the Brotherhood, or at least we pretend not to be, there's a lot to be taken away from here that we can apply to our own lives. For me, the one that impacts me the most is the last quote: all that we do and all that we are begins and ends with ourselves. So many times in my life I felt myself doing something because I'm doing it as a means to an end, to please someone, whether that would be my parents or friends or someone else, or because I believe that it's the right thing to do outside of myself, or because I believe that I would want someone else to do it as well, or because I believe that if I do it, I will be owed something by someone. And a few years ago I realized that this made no sense and this was not a useful way to live. It was much better to live by doing what you believe is right and doing what you believe is good, and also living for yourself. Because it is true that we are all going to die and that we're all going to be forgotten after enough years, and that no matter what you accomplish in this world, eventually it'll be forgotten. You will be buried with none of your money, your name will eventually be forgotten by generations, and all that you can use as consolation is knowing that you lived for yourself. This is something that Arno kind of emphasizes and that I completely agree with. It's kind of reinforced by the upper section of the speech where he says, only we can decide whether the road we walk carries too high a toll. The idea of accountability, responsibility, and realization is something that is really prevalent through Assassin's Creed, all the way from Assassin's Creed 1 to even the newer games, and it's something that I really appreciate this game emphasizes, because it makes you think, it makes you wonder, and it's led me to make a lot of decisions in my life based from this philosophy and study this philosophy in their original forms, you know, through Nietzsche and Kant and Aristotle and Socrates and other philosophers that first came up with these ideas and wrote them down on paper. So that's basically what I wanted to write down, because I find Assassin's Creed to be a deeply philosophical game that has two very distinct sides to it. One where assassins like Altair and Ezio are interesting, deep, and nuanced thinkers, while also reflecting a level of mental disturbance to be so normalized with violence and accustomed to violence, and using it as a justification, as a means to an end, that I also wanted to explore. And I actually made a whole video about how you basically have to be mentally disturbed to be an assassin. So if you want to watch that video, you can check it out now.